Hello, greetings to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm Setu, coordinator for the Foundation for Agrarian Studies Young Scholars Online Seminar Series. I welcome you to the sixth seminar in the third round of this series. The FAS Young Scholars Seminar Series is a platform for young scholars working in the field of agrarian studies to present their work among peers and experts. These seminars are a part of the Foundation's consistent efforts to engage and build a research community around agrarian studies and rural development. As part of this series, we have had scholars from various parts of the world present their work on various aspects of rural society, ranging from labor relations, agricultural production, women's work, technology, environment, and more. All of our past sessions are available at our YouTube channel. More details are also available at a dedicated page in our website. The link for this will be shared in the chat box, and we'll try to see if we can share this screen for you to see as well. In the meanwhile, let me also thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their continued support in facilitating this seminar series. Let's see. Let me begin welcoming some of the people. First of all, I would like to welcome the chair of this seminar series, Professor Barbara Harris-White. We are especially grateful, happy today because she has visited the foundation. She's joining us today from the foundation's premises. Welcome, Professor Barbara. And thank you for this immense role in... Oh, okay, sorry. So you can see the FS Young Scholar Seminars website. It's available at fs.org.in/YSOSS. Thank you, Rebecca. And back to my, I was welcoming Professor Barbara. Thank you for joining us from the foundation. And thank you for continuing to not only preside over these sessions, but also for your detailed comments and feedback for each of these seminars that we have had so far. And for today's seminar, we are excited to add a perspective from history to the diversity of this series. I would like to welcome Dr. Brian Cannon, a historian of early modern South Asia, currently serving the University of Pennsylvania as a lecturer in their critical writing program. Welcome, Dr. Brian, and he would be presenting his work titled Claiming Caste, Land, Water and Hierarchy in North India circa 1660 to 1950. Welcome to the session. Dr. Akhila Matthew, Assistant Professor of History at the School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, joins us today as the discussant for this session. She specializes in social and legal history of early modern and early colonial Rajasthan. Welcome to the seminar, Dr. Akhila.
Thanks, Setu.
Okay, and I welcome each of you who have joined us from various parts of the world, and let me not delay things any further. I invite Professor Barbara to take over the session from now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Setu. Can everybody hear me? Thanks to everyone. Normally, I am in Europe somewhere, and the speakers and the organizers are somewhere in South Asia, but today it is the exact opposite, and I'm really delighted to be physically at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in Bangalore, and also to be chairing a contribution to our learning process, which is quite unusual. It is not just deep history, it is deep social, economic, and environmental history. And the audience is, I think, I may be wrong, but normally not an audience of historians. And so one of the things that I implore everybody is to have the courage and ask all kinds of questions from your various disciplinary backgrounds. And Brian is going to have a go at fielding them all. As you all know, but I will repeat it, the rules of the game are that our speaker has about half an hour. Our discussant, Akhila, will have 10 minutes, plus or minus, for discussant's comments, after which we throw it open to Q&A, which is in the chat box. So do start thinking about questions that you'd like to put in the chat. The more, the merrier. And normally the Q&A is at least a quarter of an hour, but as you know, sometimes it It's very animated and lasts a little bit longer. So the whole seminar can be slightly elastic. Okay, without more ado, I would like to cross many oceans and invite Brian to give us a talk on caste, land, water over 3 whole centuries in Rajasthan. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Harris-White, for the introduction. It's really nice to be here with you all today. I'm joining from Philadelphia. I'm going to attempt here to share my screen. My talk today draws on my dissertation research, which I've entitled Claiming Caste, Land, Water, and Hierarchy in North India, circa 1660 to 1950. Without further ado, I think I'll just launch right in. This project demonstrates how access to sources of land and water persistently shaped claims to and contests over caste status from the mid-17th through the mid-20th centuries. I geographically root the analysis in Marwari state of northwest India, an erstwhile kingdom situated at the eastern gateway to the Thar Desert, and today part of Rajasthan state. Marwari, many of you may know, has a capital that lies at Jodhpur in the center of the region outlined in red on your left. The Thar Desert is omnipresent in this work, if not always in the foreground, as I consider the ways that the desert ecology has shaped community resource control as much as priorities of political economic administration. Precisely due to the tenuous agricultural output in light of the region's arid climate, Marwari's documentary record on inscriptions as well as paper has invested enormous energy over the centuries in tracing relationships to land. My project considers a particular category of these long documented land grants known as Sasan. Marwari's Rathore Rajput rulers, a lineage of warrior elites who also retained control over several neighboring kingdoms, extended these grants to a number of communities on a tax-free basis. Significantly, Sasan landholders, unlike most other land grant recipients, were not required to remit any land revenue to the Marwar court, nor to maintain military resources or otherwise provide service at the court's request. By investigating long-standing connections to the administration and maintenance of Sasan lands and their resources over 3 centuries, I contend that it was precisely this tax-free status that shielded Sasan recipients from administrative overreach by the Marwar court and other landholding elites. A primary and recurring argument throughout my work, therefore, is that land grant holders exhibited a great deal of autonomy in their villages by sustaining micro-hierarchies of resource access and control that were rarely, if ever, policed by the Marwar administration. This autonomy afforded Sasan grant holders significant prestige in administering and retaining over generations access to land and natural resources. I suggest that superior access to land and water, moreover, determined the caste status of communities in profound and enduring ways. I argue that processes of claiming caste, through access to land as much as through ownership of it, through caste kin as much as through blood relations, and through perceptions of association with as much as retained employment by Rajput rulers, were inextricably linked to control over land, water, and labor. By emphasizing these elements, I read caste as materially rooted in local socioeconomic hierarchies. A particular community of Sasan land grant recipients, known as the Charans, form the primary case study of my analysis. Often mischaracterized as bards, Charans have developed a singular reputation, and one that is deeply cemented by British colonial ethnographies, as genealogists and praise poets retained by the Marwar court. Though a small minority of Charans enjoyed prominent roles in the Jodhpur administration, their roles routinely exceeded the bounds of their posts. Far more significant, the majority of Charans without a regular presence in the court maintained significant community roles as landholders, owners of ponds, wells, and irrigation infrastructure, and claimants to religious authority across the Thar Desert. And I'm happy to speak to these and other roles and their embedded colonial stereotypes in the Q&A. These roles were neither overseen nor necessarily even sanctioned by the court. My work therefore intentionally avoids characterizing the court in both its pre-colonial and colonial guises as a state, because the influential workings of those outside of the court so often failed to overlap with its administrative mandate. Demonstrating proximity to visible political power became markedly significant, however, only in the first decades of the 20th century, when the very real possibility of losing access to land threatened the socioeconomic independence that such access had for generations previously assured. I traced these relationships through a deliberately long chronology from the mid-17th through the mid-20th centuries, which exhibit a period of remarkable stability in enduring relations to land, before briefly pointing, by way of conclusion, to early post-colonial land reform laws that all but overnight changed the rules of access for Sasan and other land grant holders, along with tenants, cultivators, and other agrarian laborers. For Marwar's early modern rulers, as the Mughal Empire grew in territorial expanse, both the size and monetary value of land under their control increased over time. Closely coupled with this was a robust issuance in land grants parceled off from these ancestral territories. The mid-17th century ruler, Jaswant Singh I, left much of the task of land administration to his prime minister Mohammad Nancy, whose staff oversaw land revenue collection. Nancy would ultimately leave behind a deeply consequential set of Marwari language administrative texts, including a compilation of oral historical narratives covering the whole northwestern region of the subcontinent, as well as a sweeping administrative census of the districts of Marwar. These texts' massive narrative scope and extensive statistical detail allow us to trace changes in such significant areas of focus as land ownership, water use, caste relations, demographic changes, regional administrative hierarchies, as well as political relations with other Rajput kingdoms and the Mughal imperial state. Nancy's census stands distinct from its contemporary and colonial counterparts because it enumerates socioeconomic variables entirely unseen in these other sources, such as crop surveys, documentation of irrigation and other built infrastructure, and granular statistical compilations of the agricultural conditions of more than 4,000 villages across the Kingdom of Marwar. To better examine how land administration, and particularly that of Sasan grants and water, appeared at significant distance from the Marwar court, I first turned my attention to one single district in the kingdom called Pokhran. Pokhran you will see here circled in blue on the left. This site is better known as the site of the 1970s nuclear missile tests that the federal government conducted in the desert region here. Pokhran, situated to the northwest of Jodhpur, was neither the most prosperous district nor a seat of courtly political expression. This is precisely why, however, Pokhran is invaluable in allowing us to better see its relation to decentralized, immovable natural resources. An analysis of peripheral districts such as Pokhran reveals the tenuous commitments and limits of Marwar's courtly sovereignty. In the following consideration of water in Pokhran, I emphasize one of the foundational building blocks of these considerations simply by asking who had access to water, where, and by what means. Precious few natural bodies of water meant that Marwar's population invariably looked below ground for sources of drinking water and irrigation. The politics of kin networks, markets, and bureaucratic governance undergirded access to the capital and labor required to build wells, tanks, reservoirs, and water harvesting mechanisms. Yet build Marwar did, at great expense and expanse, with significant consequences for the mid-17th century agrarian economy. Pokhran, lying squarely within the Thar Desert, was and remains water-starved in comparison with the east and south of Marwar. Despite the significant ecological disadvantage, Nancy's census records Pokhran's remarkable and sustained quest to harvest water from the district's earliest days. His statistical compilations provide remarkably granular detail of the water body types, harvesting mechanisms, water quantity and quality, and the sociality of water source builders and users. Nancy's census indicates that Marwar's entire landscape, whether urban or rural, arable or fallow, densely populated or deserted, was settled by groups of single or several primary named deed-holding landowner communities. Landholder funding would not only ensure subsequent monopoly of water sources, but also the ability to control access to it. Evidence of the caste-based nature of land, capital, and water infrastructure ownership indicates that these were marked by intensely local schemes of hierarchical control. Even a small selection of village-level data demonstrates the overlap of these many ecological, political, economic, and social factors shaping water quality, reliability, retrieval, and access. A summary counting of Pokern's Sassen villages is particularly revealing. I've attempted to very roughly map these here on the right. I'll come back to that in a moment. But just to give you a sense of some of this data, of the 15 Sassen villages in Pokern of a total 81 enumerated, all but 2 had at least one water source, and nearly half held 2 or more, typically a reservoir or pond and a deep well. The reservoirs, typically rain-fed, varied significantly in the length of time they remained full, anywhere from half a month to 10 months annually. Nearly a third of the villages were forced to look nearby for drinking water. And Nancy's clear notation about some villages taking drinking water from nearby villages held by the same caste suggests the significant role that kinship played in controlling access to water, much as it did to land. The majority, though not all, of these Sassen villages for Pokern outlined by Nancy were held by Charans, Rajputs, and Brahmins. If I come back to this map for 1 second, I just want to point out, you'll see this density of Charan villages with the red dots on the right. Strikingly, when Nancy suggests that for villages that didn't have access to water, they were essentially taking or borrowing water from nearby, it wasn't the case that they necessarily took from the village in closest proximity to them. Usually they were based on caste more than geographical proximity, which is quite striking. And this intensively caste-based nature of land access and use certainly pervades not just the 17th century, but moving forward as well. This is just an image of what the edited text of this census looks like. In spite of the financial precarity brought about by succession struggles and periodic raids for tribute by Maratha warlords from the south, issuance of Sassen grants more than doubled from the time of Nancy's accounting, circa 1660, to the second quarter of the 18th century. In examining the operation of these grants, I chart the social and economic underpinnings of land operation at significant remove from courtly influence. In the mid-18th century, a new class of records, compiled as the Sannad Parvana Bahis, emerged. This unique genre of individual petitions and administrative orders presents a striking picture of everyday disputes at the village level. These case narratives, documenting contests over rights to land and water, reveal in great granularity conflicts over shares in land, inheritance, and access to scarce water. Petitions documenting intra-caste disputes were also regularly brought before provincial bureaucrats. This series of petitions exhibits remarkable differences in the administration of agrarian social life across Marwar state, and certainly major differences from the kinds of census that I mentioned in regards to Nancy. Established Sassen landholders routinely benefited from an official deference to custom that unwittingly re-entrenched their ability to manage their land without regular bureaucratic oversight. Non-landholding, and especially lower caste petitioners, by significant contrast, most always failed to have the merits of their claims heard. And though I'll only have time today to give one example from this record series, I'm happy to speak to more related ones in the Q&A. A vague deference to custom, as I will illustrate, may well signal adjudicatory neglect, especially when officials' own interests were at stake, such as through the collection of monetary fines. Such neglect passively strengthened Charan landholders' ability to retain control over land and water. I argue that in the case of Sasan lands, the Marwar court and its provincial offices collectively served as an indifferent bureaucratic body of legal record rather than as a sovereign arbiter of political and legal conflicts. One example will help to reveal the disjuncture between the elaborate formulae of documentary practice and the characteristic vagueness with which judicial decisions were rendered. Consider the following dispute concerning shared access to a pond and well between two villages. And this is in direct translation, my translation from the original Marwari. One Charan Sadaram of the village Netari Basni says that Basni has always taken drinking water from the pond and well in Dava village. In 1763, Dava put a stop to this, and testimony from neighboring villages confirms this. Dava says at its village border, there is a watering hole for cows of Basni, and that this was dug from a well for access to drinking water. However, in 1766, villagers from Dava have blocked access to the fields surrounding the well. The authorities were made aware of this situation, and it was ordered that because Dava's well is used by Bosni as a watering hole, cows should be left to come and go there to drink. The access route should be left open in accordance with custom, and this dispute should not be raised again. This case is striking for the rare concern for ethics that the registrar demonstrates in its decision. Unlike the appeals to vague custom that typify many of the Sanat Parvana verdicts, in this case, it is explicitly tied to the Bosni cow's need for water. In contrast, a 1766 petition initiated by members of a Rathore Rajput-controlled estate, again belonging to the same lineage as the Marwar ruling family, they disputed a neighboring village's exclusive claim to several small bodies of water. But that decision simply states that these should be shared customarily as before, and that no further objection should be raised. And in that dispute, there is the verbatim language used at the end of the one you see on the screen before you. This attitude of indifference almost always benefited Charan and other Sasan landholders, who through such decisions retain their administrative autonomy in overseeing activity on their lands, and crucially, in retaining control of access to land and water. As Marwar ushered in the 19th century, significant changes in political economy shaped the kingdom's administrative mandate. The most consequential of these was, of course, the relations of subsidiary alliance that Marwar and other princely states forced with the English East India Company, requiring that the tribute Marwar previously paid to Maratha overlords was now payable in perpetuity to the company. Further changes were afoot by the mid-19th century. The significant political shift from company to crown rule in the wake of the 1857 rebellions carried out across North India, which, crucially, it should be remembered, were led by landholders and cultivators as much as by disaffected Indian soldiers serving in the company army, undoubtedly gave rise to increased focus on political economies within and among princely states such as Marwar. This twin context helps to explain a new and differently intrusive treaty effected by the British administration and signed by ruler Takht Singh in 1868 that mandated British selection of courtly ministers. Most significantly, the treaty empowered British officials to examine Marwar's treasury account records at will. This intense external focus on Marwar's fiscal health helps to explain the increased salience of land records, even those of non-revenue generating classes such as Sasan, in this high colonial moment. This included renewed styles of land accounting through the genre of the census that are remarkably comparable to the mid-17th century census of Nancy. In February of 1891, the Marwar court charged its census superintendent with carrying out a state census in Hindi to be employed within the court. And notably, that census was distinct from the one compiled at British behest, otherwise better known, of course, as the All India Census. So this was a separate census conducted by the same Marwari administrator, conducted in Hindi and to be employed mostly within the Marwar court. Here I will consider one volume of this multi-part Hindi census, a register of landholder records across all districts of Marwar, for which there is no counterpart in the corresponding British All India census, to consider the character of land grants in late 19th century Marwar. Taken in tandem with land records since the time of Nancy, the possibilities for deeply detailed comparison remain broad and exciting. We can trace individual named villages to the same caste communities over this entire 250-year period, while simultaneously observing changes in size, productive output, and landholder families. Such examination allows us to take seriously the claims to exalted caste status that so many of these recipients put forward over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, given that grants of land and their physical deeds often served as the bedrock of legal proof to bolster such claims. The Hindi language census, better known by its vernacular name Mardumshumari, from the Urdu, the counting of men, and I'll use this vernacular term to avoid confusion with the British Indian census of the same year, presents a range and granularity of data simply unseen in concurrent British Indian or vernacular census reports. The Mardumshumari details a total of 4,406 villages in Marwar, enumerated by district and containing a dozen distinct identifying criteria, including land type, assessed revenue value, landholder name, and population by gender. And you can see from the manuscript here how this was presented in tabular form, again, village by village as you go down the rows. Contemporary administrative reports indicate that the Mardumshumari almost certainly relied on previous village and district level assessments to tabulate its data. And this, I would suggest, would be distinct from the work of Nancy, who likely compiled his survey from the ground up. The striking overlap in village details compared with land surveys conducted a mere 10 years prior suggests as much. And you can see some examples of that overlap here, comparing the Mardumshumari with records from a different set of land classes on the left. Comparison across a wider swath of the 19th century likewise reveals significant overlap between the categories of village revenue and landholder caste. So beyond that decade difference, here's comparing the Mardumshumari with income records from the early 19th century. The great degree of variation in tenorial practice that the Mardumshumari highlights similarly emphasizes not just the possibility of, but the explicit need for year-on-year comparison of records. And I think this is one particularly rich contribution that princely state documents can make in these really intensively compiled year-on-year land records that we don't always necessarily see in the presidencies. As a chronologically longer comparison of Nancy's census with the Mardumshumari illustrates, again, just a few examples here. In the case of Sasan grants, the Brahmin and Charan communities proved peculiarly adept in preserving their land from the mid-17th through the late 19th centuries. And of the total Sasan villages outlined in the 1891 Mardumshumari, more than 80% were held by these two caste groups alone. In broader perspective, the ties of socio-political patronage that fostered the creation and maintenance of Sasan grants were not simply eradicated as a result of increased British oversight of land practices in Rajasthan states. Rather, they endured in spite of changing structures of political and economic incentives, even when new Sasan grants were no longer issued. And over this century, we see a marked decrease from that of the 18th century and 17th centuries that I outlined previously. That same phenomenon continues into the 20th century. By early 1891, when the Mardumshumari was conducted, Marwar was suffering from the 11th famine to afflict the region since the beginning of the 19th century. Less than a decade later, in 1900, a more severe famine killed an additional 6 lakh people within the kingdom. The 19-year-old ruler Sardar Singh was said to have emptied the state treasury in order to keep the kingdom's economy afloat. Amidst this ecological and economic crisis, the end of the 19th century witnessed significant infrastructural and fiscal changes in Marwar that profoundly reshaped the region's economy, revenue apparatus, and land administration. The first of these was the construction of an extensive railway network, which Marwar's rulers vehemently protested at first, as rail transportation would mean an inevitable loss of customs duties. And despite my focus, of course, here on land, it's important to point out that through most of this history, where accounted for, Marwar's customs revenue routinely outpaced that of land. So this was quite significant. The late 19th century also witnessed the introduction of a British land settlement on those lands whose revenues went directly into Marwar's state coffers. Those would not have comprised Sasan lands, but as I wish to point out, that had wider implications for Sasan and other land classes. With that in mind, I would ask, what did these macroeconomic changes mean for Sasan landholders at the turn of the 20th century? The strikingly consistent processes of land grant administration, dating as far back to the time of Nancy, were clearly under visible threat with the arrival of British land settlements in Marwar. And certainly there were comparable projects in other princely states. As evidentiary documentation of ownership and legal requirements in land practice changed, Sasan grants, like lands of all classes, began to be resumed by the bureaucracy in the Rajput states. The administration of the nearby kingdom of Banswara, located to the south of Marwar, initiated in the early 1920s a series of attempts to take control of lands formerly granted to Charans. Landholder legal response was striking, redeploying many of the tropes of ancient custom and close ties of Rajput patronage that marked high colonial stereotypes of the Charan community. And you can see one example of these petitions before you here, in which the vakil, or the attorney retained by these Charan petitioners seeking to get back their resumed lands, argued that in spite of facts, law, custom, usage, tradition, and sentiments, it has been the great misfortune of these petitions to suffer the loss of their lands. Ultimately, these lands were not reawarded to this particular group of petitioners, and more broadly, legal contests like this proved highly prescient of comparable challenges to post-colonial land reforms, and more immediately of how the Charan community simultaneously sought to project an image of prestige in the absence of renewed land holdings. Caste associations, whose meeting reports were widely published across the region, began to proliferate in the early 20th century. As a unique genre of evolving documentary record, shaping relations of socioeconomic privilege, these reports reveal that public caste associations became a megaphone through which landholding groups such as the Charans could reaffirm older privileges at precisely the moment when their inheritable estates appeared increasingly in jeopardy. A caste association report from 1921 details how a body of Charans convened a meeting of its caste members to decide upon and declare the group's Kshatriya status. Claiming Kshatriya status signaled an exclusive association with the ruling Rajput community. The changing social fortunes of the Rajput princes, coupled with nearly 2 centuries of financial duress from Maratha and British exactions of tribute, no doubt weakened the privileges to land and courtly patronage that some Charans genuinely did enjoy. All of these socio-political factors worked in tandem to motivate such acts of caste mobilization and consolidation. And it's important to point out that the Charans were hardly alone in this process of claiming Kshatriya status. There were many other caste groups doing just the same in this period, with comparable caste reports being put out in print. Yet success in such an endeavor, for the Charans at least, was not as straightforward as mitigating the ill effects of less reliable patronage by painting a story of a fall from grace. Occupational diversity within the Charan community also complicated the case for making the Kshatriya link. As we have seen, many of these Charans, that is, earned their primary livelihoods through managing and cultivating land, without ostensible links to Rajput patrons. Given substantial economic and occupational differentiation, it is little wonder that caste meetings were felt as an urgent need in order to unify community histories. Strikingly, this powerful rhetoric of claiming Kshatriya status was, at least in print, acknowledged by many significant individuals within the Rajput community. The power of this, of course, lies in the rhetoric more than the actual facts. And I think it was precisely this rhetoric of close Rajput affiliation through declining patronage with those Rajputs in the early half of the 20th century that ultimately led in the early years of the Indian Union to the award of OBC status to the Charan community in both Rajasthan and Gujarat. In highlighting this process of claiming caste, I ultimately contend that caste as a social phenomenon emerged most consequently not with the arrival of the British and their great 19th century ethnographic projects, such as the All India Census and Provincial Castes and Tribes Compendia, but rather with the threat of resumption and ultimate disappearance of superior access to land. For it was land, water, and other resources that largely made caste prior to this fundamental political economic restructuring. That restructuring, confined at first to the introduction of selective land settlements, as I've just mentioned, severely impacted landholders and landless cultivators alike through the eventual wholesale dismantling of older networks of land relations and caste privilege brought about by provincial land reform efforts in the early 1950s. And it's there that I would like to conclude and just say a little bit about what this meant, not just for Sasan landholders, but agrarian landed laborers and landless laborers more generally. As early as October of 1947, so that's just 3 months after the British left the subcontinent, Marwari undertook a new land accounting of all of its villages, I think perhaps seeing the writing on the wall in newly independent India with the possibility of land reform. Marwari acceded to the newly created state of Rajasthan in 1949, and it was only 3 years later in 1952 that that state of Rajasthan implemented something known as the Land Reform and Resumption of Jagirs Act. This was particularly significant because in keeping with a constitutional clause, that is the constitution of the new nation, the types of different land classes were homogenized. They were effectively all categorized as jagirs, and beyond a particular land ceiling, then these lands would have been resumed and attempted to be redistributed. There were tenancy laws in place that also changed relationships, not just for these former landed estate holders, such as some of the Charans, but for many others as well. So I ultimately want to argue that the Land Reforms Act represents a real structural break as one of deep discontinuity from the comparative period of stability that I traced in the prior 3 centuries. Like those 3 centuries, however, we can of course read this intersectionality between kinship and ecology and economic interdependence in land relations. It's just in a completely different and much more centralized bureaucratic light than that of what I outlined before. So I think I'll leave it there, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. Can you hear me? Yes. That was a really fascinating account from records, historical records across many centuries from a princely state, which I think are less studied. The princely states are less studied than the provinces of colonial India. So it gives us a long-term vision of the role of land and water. I want to hand it over to Akila, but before I do, your records mention wells, and I'm going to ask you, if Akila doesn't, about the animal economy and how the labor was organized to generate the energy to dig and manage that well water irrigation. So there is an animal story, which you didn't mention at all. Anyway, without more ado, I would like to hand it over to the perfect discussant who is expert on all this field, to Akila Matthew. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Barbara. And I hope you can hear me. Yes. And thanks, Brian, for that very engaging talk. So let me start with some of the things that I really kind of looked forward to, and which kind of is what came through in the paper, which is firstly the vast kind of temporal scope of this paper. And, usually historians kind of get limited to the pre-colonial or to the colonial or to the post-colonial periods. So to kind of cover this long time period from the 17th to the 20th century, and presenting a long durée history of the Charans has been, I'm sure it was a very difficult task. And in this, I would also want to mention, because some of the primary sources that you've gone through, I've gone through as well, I know how difficult they are. So I would like to kind of, also talk about how the pre-colonial Jodhpur Sanat Parwana Bahis, for instance, in the very rich Rajasthan State Archives in Bikaner, but very difficult archives, in my opinion, to work in. So that way also, I think it is quite incredible. The other thing that your work kind of effectively does is to, again, combine many things which I believe in the historiography of Rajasthan has been done separately, which is the study of environmental history, agrarian studies, history of land, history of caste, as well as looking at specifically this caste group, the Charans, who have largely been looked at through the lens of folklore, Charan Rajput relations, etc. So your attempt to combine all of these different histories, which for me have been largely disjointed, or in my opinion have been largely disjointed, I think is quite, again, an incredible feat. Having said that, two kind of broader writings in which I would like you to locate your work. Firstly is, emerging from something that you mentioned, but also works like the work of Tanuja Kotyal on the Thar Desert, for instance, right? Which I think is very relevant to your work as well, is to look at the landscape in the sense that not look at Marwar in isolation. Marwar is it's an arid region. It is a region whose the name itself, Marudesh, right? It is about the desert, right? So in a way to kind of do a much more kind of, or help us understand how the kind of state intervention or the state valuing land, water, and other kind of resources, how is it different from other regions of Western India, maybe from even Mewad or the state of Kota, southeastern part of Rajasthan, for instance, where again I'm bringing the work, the lens of landscape, because the landscape of the plains, the desert, and the state response to such landscape. Is it at all different from what is happening in other places where, the forested landscape, of, south and southeastern Rajasthan, for instance? So I would like you to locate your work, and specifically what you're talking about in the context of Marwar. Is it different from what is happening in, southeastern Rajasthan, for instance? The other scholarship that I would be interested for you to locate your work on is the scholarship on caste, of course, because your title itself talks about caste. How would you locate your work in terms of the existing historiography on not just the origins of caste, but also the reshaping of caste? Because there have been works on how caste is the kind of reordering of the caste, as you talk about with respect to the Charans, right? Them at some point claiming to have a Kshatriya status. Is it only through land that they're doing it, or are there other ways? For instance, through social practices, or even through control over women, for instance, which is, for the goldsmith community in the 18th century, that is one way in which they claim social mobility, is by saying that we as a community do not practice widow remarriage, right? So in a way, do you see the reordering of the Charan caste, right, which you are talking about? Could you locate it in much more broader kind of changes, which would also kind of talk about maybe changing social practices and the role of gender? The last thing that I want to talk about, and this is because I found the one slide on the legal petitioning quite interesting, is that I think what your work kind of really fits into the work on law, and especially on legal pluralism, I believe. So in early modern Rajasthan itself, you see law being, there being multiple legal regimes, in fact, overlapping legal regimes, your panchayats, jagirdars, the Rajput state, etc., all of which is complicated in the 19th century with the expansion of the colonial state, right? So when you say that the Charans are petitioning, right, they are petitioning to claim that they have rights over land, are they in any way manipulating any of these legal regimes to gain legal rights or to retain their control over land? So in a way, to kind of make a comment on law itself, or the legal regimes itself, as scholars have done in other parts of South Asia, I think your work would really fit into that in terms of addressing questions of legal pluralism as well, if you are kind of interested in that, right? The last small bit that I want to kind of talk about is on Vajbi, because you talk about customary norms and customary practices, right? The state responding to these, the areas that are given out as shasan, you talk about how the state is responding to it through reference to customary practices. Again, it is not just about shasan grants, right? It is a common language in the Jodhpur Sanat Parwana Bahis, right? Not just limited to these kind of grants. So then how would you place your argument of autonomy? Because then the state is kind of giving autonomy to almost everyone, right? Because the state is relying on customary practices, usually jati-based practices, right? Not just in Rajasthan, but as works of Sumit Guha would show in the case of Maharashtra and other areas as well, right? So, is there something different happening in the context of these Shasan grants, right? When you talk about Vajbi. And I will kind of I leave it there and, try and answer.
Thank you very much, Akila. 3 really powerful comments. Brian, would you like to respond? There are some questions in the Q&A. It's not in the chat box, but in the Q&A. And in the audience, do add to that box. But Brian, would you like to respond to Akila's points?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much, Akila, for these really thoughtful comments. This is really useful for me to think with. Your point is absolutely well taken, that we should look, or I should look beyond Marwar as just its own region. That's part of the reason why I've tried to frame this within the broader contours of the desert more generally. So certainly agreed that the work of Tanuja Kotial is highly relevant here. As far as comparisons to other regions, so one of the things that's really striking is the way in which Marwar accounts for land is not entirely comparable to the way that land is accounted for in neighboring kingdoms. And I think part of that has to do with differential access to water and also differential access to markets and labor. So Marwari to the southeast, comparatively water rich, right? And also a different topography. Those records look different. Jaipur to the east, on which we know much more about as far as land accounting is concerned, isn't concerned with the same kinds of variables that Marwari is concerned with. So one of the most notable things is that Jaipur routinely accounts for actual produce output. You rarely get those figures in the Marwari land accounting. You'll get an assessed value, but you'll rarely see an actual enumeration of how much produce was actually cultivated at a given period. I think part of the reason for that has to do just with the precarity of the ecology. But it's a striking difference in the kinds of variables of interests for land surveyors in all of these neighboring states. Your point about Kshatriyas is extremely well taken. And I was smiling when you mentioned a comment on sort of emulation of lifestyle practices, because I was thinking back to a Charan wedding that I attended a number of years ago, in which the bride and any females for that matter were nowhere to be seen. And when I asked why, I was told, well, this is the way the Rajputs do it. Right. So the ceremony, of course, happened between the groom and the father of the bride, and women were segregated elsewhere. So yes, not just at this early 20th century moment that I'm talking about, but certainly into the present, there is an emulation of Rajput customs, Rajput lifestyle practices that we see at work. Again, I think part of that has to do with this larger project of claiming this close affiliation, despite the fact what I'm trying to suggest that the number of Charans actually affiliated in Rajput courts was quite small by comparison, right? So we might see that as kind of a process of Sanskritization, if you will, a sort of claiming of a higher status to harken back to this patron link, which again only existed for a minority in the community. Lastly, I really appreciated your point about legal pluralism and the manipulation of legal regimes. One of the things that I did not have time to discuss is that the Charans were also privileged in a sense that Sasan landholders were entitled to seek the redressal of grievances in a particular tribunal that was essentially mapped out just for Sasan landholders and other revenue-free landholders. I have some more work on this in the dissertation itself, but what I suggest there is that although they had this sort of privileged space in which to seek grievance redressal, they weren't confined to that space. So where adjudications were not in their favor, they could essentially move around to find, and I see you're smiling. You probably see that, of course, in the Sanad Pravanabahis too, where there's often a referent back to other cases and a suggestion that somebody went here to Len Panchayat and are now here instead in a different legal realm. So yes, there certainly was a degree of moving around to sort of seek out favorable verdicts, and that's certainly a literature that I certainly would like to engage with even further as I seek to revise this for publication. So thank you so much for the really rich comments. I really appreciate it.
Very good. There are two questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to take them in order. And as I said before, if anybody wants to add to that number, do feel free to do that. Kushagra has a question about, which follows up on what you've just said about legal pluralism, I think, and asks, how did the specific colonial legal framework within the princely state affect caste-based access to resources? That's a pretty huge question, but can you respond to that?
Sure. I might just say in brief that, thank you for the question, that as both Akila and I have just pointed out, there was this great degree of legal pluralism. One of the things that I think is striking about looking at legal spaces in even the high colonial moment of the 19th century is we don't just see an imposition of certain kinds of practices. Just like with land accounting and land revenue apparatuses, we see an extensive degree of borrowing from earlier periods. That's true even in the kinds of legal vocabulary that are spelled out in various classes of records. So, for example, the one tribunal that I just mentioned, to which Sasan landholders had sort of a ability to access, they mention related tribunals, one of which was called the Appeal Adalat. So the word appeal is just written out in Nagari in English, the word appeal. And so the Appeal Adalat, the Appeal Tribunal. Again, all of which is to say there was ability for these petitioners to navigate legal spaces rather than just being confined to a particular place. So there certainly were, colonial desires to see differences, say, between customary law versus, Hindu law versus Muslim personal law. But in the records that I've looked at for Marwar, there certainly is just a great degree of overlap or an amalgamation between these differing spaces that we see through a borrowing of legal vocabulary.
Thank you very much, because that could have been a very complicated answer. The other question that's currently in the Q&A is from Vani, which is, yes, we have heard about caste, but was there anything in the historical records that reflected agrarian class structure? So Vani is instancing tenancy, cultivators, landless laborers, landlords, because you've focused on a landed caste. So the question really is pushing you to tell us something more about the capacity of the records to shed light on agrarian structure.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I want to emphasize again that it wasn't the case that all Chardans were landed, which is why I really insist on using this word access more than ownership, right? So it was ability to access resources through kin that was as significant as having direct ownership thereof. As far as relationships between landed groups such as the Chardans and others, we certainly do see some relations spelled out in the records. I think probably most clearly, given that the kinds of census records I just mentioned really only account for landed groups, we probably see this most clearly in the kinds of 18th century records that I just spoke about, the Sanad Parvana class of records and others, in which we see adjudications on disputes on these lands. So not necessarily of the owners of those lands, but any kind of activity happening on them, right? So to provide one example, there's a case from that record series in which a Jat cultivator approached the tribunal to seek redressal about a debt that remained, or rather the Charan sought redressal at the tribunal about a debt that remained unpaid by a Jat cultivator on his land. And the registrar takes great care to detail the rupee value of every item that the Jat cultivator had supposedly taken as a result of taking on this debt, but then ultimately says, the adjudication is something like, this debt should be paid back and relations should remain as they were. That's essentially all we get. So there's not a great deal of what's the word I'm looking for? I guess of lenience as far as those things go. But as I suggest, I think it was through these narrative types of records, such as the Sanad Parvana Bahis, that we would see these relations more certainly than in the census type material that I've outlined, in which we really only get information about landed groups. Into the 20th century, of course, as groups, again, not just the Charans, but other groups with even more tenuous links to the land are claiming Kshatriya status in a partial attempt to, account for these, or to claim close relationships of patronage with Rajputs and other elite groups. We see other lower caste groups and landless groups doing precisely this work. So I would say on the whole, more through the narrative type of records, more than the tabular records, the statistical detail.
Thank you. Professor Ramachandran is on a train and put his hand up, but I can't see him, but he has a question.
Can you see me now? Can you see me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
And then Sumit Samas has a question, which I'll take after Prof. Ram. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, and thank you, of course, Brian Cannon. I take encouragement from Barbara's suggestion that we be bold and ask questions, even if we're not quite in the field. Now I appreciate this, of course, the entire attempt, social and economic relationships, and the control of access to land, water, and other natural resources. Your idea that caste must be viewed as a social phenomenon and a materially grounded perspective of caste. But I really can't understand how any of this can be done without understanding of the social formation on which we have, the other thing, of course, is very interesting introduction to the sources and the richness of sources in Rajasthan. And that, the sort of backing and forthing between Dr. Matthew and Brian Cannon was very interesting, though we were
Speak louder, we've lost you.
I think we've lost you, Ram. The general gist of the question that he was developing is about the social formation. And what I'd like to do, unless and until we get back in contact, is to relate that to the question of Sumit Samos, which is in the Q&A, which is basically, do the records enlighten us on any claims to status and to honor of laboring classes and lower caste groups? So I see the specific question as a special case of the larger question which Ram was developing.
The short answer is yes, we certainly do. So again, it's the narrative records, such as the Sanad Parvana Bahis, that inform us about this more than the tabular kind of statistical censuses that I've also analyzed. To give you one example of that, there's another narrative in that series in which a chamar is...
Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, that's probably too late now.
Ram, Brian is answering the first part of your question. So if you have another aspect, could you listen to him first and let him finish and then respond?
No, Mama, I just had to finish the sentence. Yeah, please. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Over to you, Brian.
Sure. There's an example from that series of a chamar, or what the British ethnographies would label as a low caste leather worker, right? Today would be largely enumerated as Dalit in many states of northern India, who was seeking to access water from a well based on a Charan land, in which at one point he was blocked access to this well. So he approached the local tribunal to say, I've always had access to this water. Why is it that somehow I'm no longer being able to access it? And the decision is rendered in such a language to say that this guy has always had access to the water, continue to allow him to access it. So maybe that's a sort of micro example of the kind of question that Sumit is getting at.
No, it's not at all. No, is that a reply to me? Is that a reply to me? Was that
No, that was a
my
that
comment
was a
in that
that was a reply
now?
to Sumit's question about claims to status by lower caste groups.
Oh,
Um,
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Sorry.
that's just one example of that. As far as your question in regards to the wider social formation, that is something that I spell out in the longer work. And now that I hear the question, I'm realizing I probably should have spent a little bit of time trying to spell out here at the start. So I think the question is about how different caste groups related to one another. Is that a fair understanding of the question? In regards to social formation more generally?
Why don't you take it on? Because
Okay,
I'm sure Ram
sure.
is
Yeah.
listening.
So I think that's where you were going with the question. That, of course, changes significantly from decade to decade and century to century. I don't in any way want to suggest that that was obviously static across this long 3-century period. However, what I do want to suggest is that it was the Charan's relationship to land that afforded them a higher status over time, even if at any given point they were either in or falling out with their Rajput patrons, where in fact they had said patrons. So as far as a broader social formation is concerned, I think even in a group like the Charans, it's very hard to read them as static or to suggest that just because they held land or just because some of them were retained by the Rajput courts, that they were absolutely higher on the hierarchical scale than others. To Akila's point, more broadly, what I've tried to do is sort of shatter that notion of stasis to suggest that even within caste groups, we're talking about fairly significant degrees of variation. And that's just important to keep in mind.
Thank you. We have a wonderful question, a very long question, which I'm going to summarize from Meenakshi Amujam. And her question is really about the enormous detail that you've thrilled us with over the centuries in these official records. The detail of these official records is very rich, but it also changes over the century. So her question is, how does that change in the content of records affect our analysis of land and of land relations? And I would like to add, what historical processes led to the historical changes in the contents of those land records, of the detail?
Thank you. It's a great question,
Yeah.
and one that I've thought a lot about. Given the obvious degree of diversity across these different types of land records that I've analyzed, right? One of the reasons I start with Nancy is because, as I suggested, it's one of the sort of really first comprehensive land censuses that we have of the region. So it allows us to read forward in really productive ways. But arguably as, if not more important, Nancy highlights variables that are totally unseen even into the 19th century in relation to water. That kind of detail that I was able to spell out, just pulling directly from his data in relationship to the number of months, for example, that a well is filled with water. We don't see that degree of detail. I can't entirely or I can't really satisfyingly answer even for myself as to what perhaps might have motivated the enumeration of particular variables at one time or another. But as I say, I think Nancy is deeply important because it allows us to look at kinds of granular types of detail that we don't get in later periods. Notably, although I didn't mention it, Nancy also has a second sort of set of records that is narrative in scope. So I don't want to suggest with my introduction of the narrative records in the 18th century that there was nothing narrative before then. But there certainly is an obsession with, from the 19th century forward, in particular with tabular data and of having tabular data be seen as definitive. And I think a lot of that had to stemmed from sort of record keeping mentalities, part and parcel of the British Indian census. But just seeing that as wholly descriptive, when of course you're right to note in the question that was not the case. I really appreciate this reference to the work of Richard Samaras Smith in the question, because I think he does precisely this. So he works, for those of you who may not know, on colonial Punjab in at least the one monograph that I'm thinking of in the 19th century, where if one were only to look at the colonial records, you would get a very different picture of land relations than he is ultimately able to spell out, given his really intensive accounting with local level land records. So there needs to be, I think, a significant degree of triangulation, not just between classes of records, but hierarchies of records at different levels of the administration, from the village level up.
Thank you. Setu, who's organizing this in the background, do we have time for one more question?
I think we do. We can have one more.
Well, I would like to ask the question that I asked before, link it up with Professor Ram's question about agrarian structure and agrarian social formation. That reading your abstract, as I did before your presentation, I was overwhelmed with the sheer problems of managing resources in a desert region before electricity and diesel came onto the scene. And as I said before, the building of the wells which enable crop production to take place. And your account is, if anything, very crop oriented. But there must have been a pastoral economy. There must have been pastoral networks piercing through the territorial regions that you have examined so closely. And in order to obtain the water that was necessary for crop production in any shape or form, you needed animals. You needed the energy of human beings, but mostly the energy of animals. So I was very pleased that water played such a very important part alongside land in the resource base. But I'm curious why you are blind to animals. And I wonder whether there are no records about the animal economy and the class and tribal and caste relations that actually swirl around the provision of animal energy, without which you don't have a crop economy at all.
Thank you for the question. I did want to come back to this. This is really important and really helpful for me to think with, because I think it is a really notable oversight in the longer work that is something that I can think through more carefully as I work to revise this. Certainly, yes, this is important. And I think this also helps to get at Professor Matthews' point in relation to thinking about the wider geography beyond just Marwar. So, right, if we're talking about pastoralist networks, pastoralist economies, then how do we account for that overlap beyond the square borders of Marwar, right? So, yeah, that's really important. Nancy does have some statistical detail on animals as far as counts, like livestock counts. I honestly don't know about the 18th century. I would have to think about what may be there, but certainly into the 19th century, with the kinds of census documents that I've discussed, we also do get livestock counts. In the narrative records, of course, as you saw from the one example that I showed in the slides, we also get examples relating to animal usage. But I agree with you. I think it would be really valuable to think holistically about sort of total numbers and how that all helped to drive overlapping agrarian economies, not just in Marwar, but in wider areas. Because of course you're right that unless we're talking about a shallow well through which water could be pulled up by hand, the only way the water was getting to the top was through animals, right? So I really appreciate the question. I'm sorry I don't have a particularly satisfying answer, but that might be a useful thread for me to follow moving forward as far as sort of accounting of animals and what that meant, how that changed over time. I've been really interested on a sort of separate but related vein in how very nicely digitized and accessible the 2011 socioeconomic and caste census data is. And there are lots of great livestock data there. So it's just useful to see how those sort of accounting incentives have changed over time too. But thank you so much for the question. It's really useful for me to think with moving forward.
Okay. Well, thank you. It has been very, very rich seminar and terrific questions. Thanks to everybody who contributed and who participated. And I will turn it over to the foundation to wind this seminar up. But I just want to congratulate everybody in Foundation for Agrarian Studies and wish them a very happy retreat, which is happening at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning for 3 days. I think you have a lot to celebrate as well as to discuss. Congratulations to everyone. Have a happy time. Thank you, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, Akila. Over to Setu.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I would let Rebecca speak for all of us.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Setu. Before we conclude, I would like to take a moment to extend our sincere gratitude. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I would like to express our appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Brian T. Cannon, for his engaging and thought-provoking presentation. His insights have enriched our understanding and contributed to a very meaningful discussion. We are also grateful to our discussant, Dr. Akila Matthew, for moderating the session and for her perceptive interventions that added depth to the conversation. Our sincere thanks to Professor Barbara Harris-White for visiting our office and also for chairing the session and for her continued guidance in shaping this seminar series. Her contributions have been invaluable in expanding its scope. A special acknowledgement to the FAS online team, Sandeepan, Tapas, and Setu for their efficient coordination in ensuring the smooth conduct of this seminar. We also extend our gratitude to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their support, which has made this series possible. Finally, a big thank you to all our attendees for your engagement and thoughtful participation, which made this session all the more enriching. The recording of the session will soon be available on YouTube. To learn more about the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and our work, please visit our website at fas.org.in. We are active on social media, and you can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. I request you to follow us on all these platforms to stay updated on this seminar series as well as all other initiatives. With this, we conclude today's session. Once again, thank you all for your valuable time and participation.